Hi, and welcome to another episode of Talking Trade. I'm Ian Coxhead at the University of Wisconsin.
And I'm Sandi Siegel, president of MEJ. Today, we're welcoming back our guest, Mike Dankler, a principal at Michael Best Strategies. Mike, you're on the ground in Washington, and you've been influential on various trade policies, trade bills, and had input on things like the Section 232 duties and initiatives. So I'm really anxious to hear your insight on what's going on in Washington in regards to Russia sanctions and the Russia policy today, and perhaps, certainly something we're all keeping an eye on. So, like to hear about, your perspective, what's going on. It seems like there's additional rounds of sanctions being announced daily with the escalation in Ukraine and Russia. So perhaps you can start by bringing us up to date on where we are and some of the recent, sanctions announced.
Yeah, of course. And thanks for having me back. I really appreciate it. But you're correct. It seems like every day there's something new coming out somewhere around the world, whether it's the US or any of our allies. The US has been very careful to coordinate with the EU, UK, and others on these sanctions. And so what we've seen recently is a lot of refinement, expansion of existing sanctions. So expanding to additional banks or tightening sanctions on banks, additional individuals, or again, expanding or tightening those. We're seeing bans on investment into Russia and other sanctions that just make debt payments more difficult. So we're seeing kind of across the board just a lot of kind of things that they've already done, but they leave things on the table at the same time that they can then go back and again, either tighten or just expand to other individuals, family members, things like that.
So can you explain a little bit on, how it's impacting some of us here, even in the US, in regards to, OFAC and the focus on aerospace and marine and electronics? That seems to put controls on, even some of us in the US, if you have interest in that. Can you explain the dynamics and the thought process a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the early sanctions was a very robust export control regime that a number of countries, in addition to the US, have gotten involved in. The US was, again, very careful to coordinate with countries that would make these sanctions especially impactful. And so we have export, you can't export high-tech goods, avionics, marine equipment, a number of kind of high-tech goods that essentially choke off Russian industry and their military industrial complex from being able to produce. And so we're seeing a lot of factory shutdowns over there as the US was very careful, not just to ban US companies from doing, from exporting, but instituting what's called foreign direct product rules, which we've only really seen one other time on Chinese tech giant Huawei, where it basically says any company anywhere can't use US technology or machines to send some of those goods over to Russia as well. So that includes China and other countries that, may have been avenues for evasion. So obviously you got to enforce all of that, but again, the US at least got a lot of Japan and other countries that are really important for those supply chains to agree to it and say, okay, we're not going to send that stuff to Russia.
And Mike, we're starting to hear quite a bit, I think, from Congress and elsewhere, sense of some kind of impatience about how long it's going to take for sanctions to really bite and have an effect. We all know that that's a slow process, but that anxiety is out there very much. Yesterday, the US banned all transactions in any currency by Sberbank, the biggest financial institution in Russia, and by the largest private bank as well, Alpha Bank. They announced a ban on all new investment by American firms into Russia and an impending ban on transactions by Russian state-owned firms. Lots of measures there, lots of new measures, as you said, very highly coordinated with other countries as well. What sanctions are left on the table, and how long do you think it's going to take before they really start to bite in terms of Russian effort in Ukraine?
Yeah, it's really, I think what's still left on the table is just that extension, refinement, tightening for the most part. The one area where the US and EU and others haven't really gone the full way is on energy. The US more so than the EU, but the EU is just so reliant on Russian oil and gas that they can't go too far yet without really hurting themselves. So they banned Russian coal imports, but they just haven't been able to go as far as that yet. They've left some of the banks that facilitate energy transactions on sanctions. So that's kind of the one place where really there's more that could be done. But again, you could sanction more commodities and things, but then you're starting to, again, hurt yourself at a time when aluminum and some of these other commodities are already going up. So in terms of how long these sanctions might take, I mean, it's the billion trillion dollar question right now. There's some of those longer term sanctions like the export controls that those are going to have an effect on the long term on the factories and everything. But all these banking sanctions, again, the ones that the US just announced, they make a default almost imminent, it seems like, from what the financial experts are saying. And so again, how does that impact Russia's ability to prosecute its war? That's kind of the main question. And the secondary question of what does Vladimir Putin consider a win? And they're redeploying forces. And so, it seems like he's content to keep going. And that's, that's the X factor there is, you can sanction him all he wants, but if he says keep going, they're going to keep going as much as they can.
I guess they're going to just keep redirecting resources towards the war effort, right?
Exactly.
So we've got the direct impact of the war, thinking about the rest of the world. We've got the direct impact of the conflict itself. We've got the impact of sanctions and trade bans with Russia. And then we've got the kind of knock-on effects from things like higher energy prices through the European market. So what is the impact, or what is the evolving impact, I guess, on global supply chains? What do you see happening there?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty wide ranging. Russia, isn't as interconnected. I mean, a lot of people make the parallels between, what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, with China and Taiwan. The Russian impact on supply chains is more from a commodity perspective. They just aren't as interconnected with Western supply chains. China just makes much more stuff. And so, what we do see though is all those pricing impacts, oil, a lot of grains. Ukraine and Russia are massive producers of wheat. And Belarus, which has been helping out Russia, and Russia are both big in fertilizer. So big impacts on agriculture, and to the extent that, there's a lot of worries about potential issues with famine or just food supply shortages. But we haven't seen that yet, but that's definitely a concern, is Ukraine may not be able to plant those crops and then get them out of their ports, which are all bombed out or occupied by Russians. And Russia, the net effect of all these financial sanctions is that any transaction with any Russian business, you really have to do a lot of due diligence to make sure what bank's involved, who owns this, this business that you're transacting with. And, it makes it very difficult to do any business with Russia, because you're just, you don't know who's on the other end of that. And we're allocating, the US is allocating a lot of money towards sanctions enforcement. So you don't want to end up on the other end of that.
Sure.
So there's big impacts from the pricing perspective on supply chains, but we're not necessarily seeing some of those other disruptions yet.
I can share, we've had a few anecdotes, with our transactions. Certainly, it's yet another thing, escalating pricing in transportation with, we've seen fuel surcharges go up to 60% on the West Coast, and in reaction. So, again, another strain on the cost of transportation and moving goods. And I can say that both on import and export, we've transactionally had some challenges, goods stuck, and had fish from Russia on its way here, frozen fish, and a few commodities that got stuck along the way. So as you say, it's not a huge trading partner, for us in the Midwest, but I think, more relevant to the economy as a whole, and how it's impacting us.
Exactly.
Terrific.
What if you were a US agribusiness or farm enterprise? What kind of knock-on effects would you be seeing there? Obviously, prices are going to start jumping pretty sharply as the impact of lower crop planting in Ukraine and Russia starts to feed through the system. What else?
Yeah, I mean, I think thus far from everything I've heard, it's mostly the prices right now. I mean, and the question is what does Ukraine? I mean, they're trying to plant those crops. They're trying to get that stuff on the ground, and so the kind of all eyes are going to be on that and how the global waves ripple out. Do there end up being food shortages? Do we have to kind of try to share some of that? And try to alleviate a global panic. So that's what we're seeing thus far. It doesn't mean there won't be more issues coming out, but all those fertilizer and grain exports never really came here.
Right.
But all of a sudden, all of those other avenues are cut off, and so that just sends big shockwaves through the global markets for those commodities.
Oh, exactly. Mike, thank you for joining us again. Always great insight. And again, you're right there in the front line. So really helpful to get your perspective.
Thanks for having me again. I appreciate it.
Thanks again, Mike. And this has been another episode of Talking Trade. See you in the next time.